Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, encountering a thinker whose ideas are just so bold, so revolutionary, they feel like they could totally change how you see the world. But then, well, you try to read them,
Yeah.
and it's like hitting a wall. Dense language, really complex concepts, references you maybe never even heard of. That, for many people, is kind of the experience of encountering Gilles Deleuze.
Yeah, Gilles Deleuze, living from 1925 to 1995, he's definitely a towering figure in late 20th century philosophy, but also, yeah, deeply divisive. He's known for creating these entirely novel concepts, things like, well, multiplicity, difference, desire, and for these really audacious reinterpretations of classic philosophers, think Kant, Spinoza, Nietzsche. And like you said, this isn't easy stuff. It's challenging almost by design, it feels like.
Exactly. And because his work is so challenging and his ideas are just so radical, the reactions, well, they span this huge spectrum. You get devoted adherents, people who absolutely swear his work changed their lives,
Yeah.
all the way to trenchant condemnation, which is a strong word, right? It means really fierce, cutting criticism.
Right. And what's fascinating here, I think, is that today's deep dive isn't actually into Deleuze's philosophy itself. Not directly, anyway. Instead, we're focusing specifically on that other end of the spectrum, the criticisms, the attacks leveled against him. We're looking at what critics see as the alleged invalidities in his work.
Right. So our source material for this deep dive
Hmm.
is a document that gathers and examines these critiques, especially the ones that are pretty, well, attacking in tone is how it puts it. They're aiming to pinpoint problems like contradictions within his ideas or inconsistencies, maybe outright incoherence, arguments critics feel are unfair, even claims that he misunderstood things or just made mistakes.
Mm-hmm. And the report points out that these criticisms often come from really deep disagreements. Disagreements with Deleuze's foundational assumptions, his starting points, or his notoriously difficult style, which we've already touched on, or maybe the radical, sometimes unsettling implications of the concepts he created, the consequences of his ideas.
So, our mission for you today is really to help you navigate this landscape of criticism. Why do people attack Deleuze so forcefully? What specifically do they find invalid or wrong about his work? We'll unpack these challenges based only on what our source material tells us. We're sticking to the document here.
Yeah, and for someone new to philosophy, understanding why a major figure like Deleuze is criticized is actually incredibly valuable. It's not just about, accepting or rejecting the ideas themselves. It's about learning to think critically within philosophy. You could think of it like learning about the weak points of a building structure to understand its limits. It gives you a much fuller, more nuanced picture.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this deep dive. We'll kick off by looking at the overall critical landscape, just getting the lay of the land. Then, we'll dive into the challenges critics find specifically with his writing style and his philosophical method, how he does philosophy. After that, we'll explore accusations of incoherence or contradiction in his actual ideas, the substance of his thought. And then we'll move on to critiques of how he reinterprets other philosophers from history. That's a big one.
Definitely. We'll also examine the attacks that come from thinkers working within different established traditions like Marxism or psychoanalysis, people coming at him from different angles. We'll cover the famous science wars criticisms that's about his use of scientific and mathematical ideas. And finally, we'll look at specific problems critics identify with some of his most famous core concepts like desire or the body without organs.
Right.
Yeah.
This deep dive. Well, it won't necessarily be easy, just like reading Deleuze isn't easy. But we'll go through all these different types of criticisms step by step. We'll use the details our source provides to give you a really clear picture of the intellectual battleground surrounding his work. Let's jump in.
Right. Let's start with that overall critical landscape. Our source material tells us that Deleuze consciously positioned himself quite deliberately apart at what it calls substantial remove from the main traditions of 20th century continental thought. So this act of setting himself apart, choosing to work outside the dominant philosophical currents of his time, that inherently invited controversy. When you challenge the established ways of thinking, you naturally provoke reactions from those who operate within those traditions.
And he really was challenging fundamental ideas. The material mentions his critique of representation, which is, a core philosophical concept, how we understand things as standing for or representing other things, like how the word cat represents an actual cat. Deleuze challenged this whole way of thinking, and he championed becoming over being. So shifting the philosophical focus away from fixed identities or states of existence being towards processes, change, flux, becoming. These weren't just like minor tweaks, they were big disruptive philosophical moves.
Precisely. And the sheer difficulty of his work, as we've noted, is often the very first point of attack for critics. It really is. The source points out that critics frequently highlight his extensive use of concepts from science and mathematics alongside what they describe as arcane and wacky metaphors.
Mm.
They argue that these elements make his work alienating and just plain difficult for readers to grasp.
Yeah, you can almost visualize that difficulty, can't you? Imagine trying to read a philosophical text, and it expects you to follow discussions that jump between, I don't know, advanced calculus concepts, obscure historical figures, and then suddenly uses these bizarre metaphors involving complex machines or like spreading root systems to explain an idea. It can feel incredibly dense, really hard to follow. And critics often steve on that difficulty as a problem with the philosophy itself, not just, the reader needing more background.
Mm-hmm. And the source report we're using focuses specifically on the kind of critiques it examines, those that are attacking in tone, as it says, and they aim to identify what critics see as fundamental flaws, alleged contradictions, inconsistencies, incoherence, unfair arguments, even misunderstandings, misconceptions, mistakes, misapprehensions in his work. These are challenges not just to his conclusions, but to the core validity, the soundness of his thinking process and arguments.
And these criticisms, as the report notes, often arise from really deep disagreements with his fundamental working assumptions, the basic starting points he takes. They also stem from issues with his notoriously difficult style, as we mentioned, or from the radical, sometimes, unsettling implications of the new concepts he creates. If his concepts lead to conclusions that strongly contradict other philosophical or political views, well, then those working within those views are likely to attack the concepts themselves, right?
Exactly. What's particularly interesting, though, according to the source, is the suggestion that the attacking tone of many critics is arguably a reflection of Deleuze's own philosophical approach. He and Felix Guattari, his main collaborator on some major works like Anti-Oedipus, they describe their philosophical method not as, a gentle, peaceful dialogue aiming for consensus, but as a violent encounter between heterogeneous forces. They saw philosophy itself as a clash, a battle between different, often incompatible ideas.
That's a powerful image, like he was intentionally setting up a philosophical battleground. The source mentions Deleuze himself believed a worthwhile book must be polemical, meaning it has to be argumentative, and, crucially, it has to reveal errors in other scholarship. It needs to pick a fight, intellectually speaking.
Exactly. His stated goal was to deliberately break with conventional thinking, to produce a philosophy that would actively shake us out of our usual ways of seeing and understanding. Naturally, if you're aiming to disrupt conventional thought and shake people up, you're going to provoke strong, often negative reactions, especially from those whose own philosophical foundations, assumptions, or cherished ideas are being directly challenged by your work. So yeah, the attacking tone from critics can be seen, in a way, as mirroring Deleuze's own disruptive philosophical project. It's like, the analogy. If someone walks into a room and aggressively challenges everyone's most deeply held beliefs, they shouldn't really be surprised when people push back just as forcefully, using similarly strong language.
That makes a lot of sense in understanding the kind of heat around his work. Another point the source highlights is how his method, drawing from such a wide range of sources, makes him a tricky target. He pulls from this vast and eclectic range, including minor figures maybe not always seen as central to philosophy, and influences that are incredibly diverse, crossing different disciplines.
And he also extensively reinterpreted canonical philosophers like Kant, Spinoza, Nietzsche figures many philosophers have their own, established views on. This wide-ranging interdisciplinary approach, pulling from so many different fields and thinkers while reinterpreting major historical figures, well, it makes him a difficult target for any single unified critique. You can't easily critique his work just from one narrow perspective.
So instead, he faces what the source calls a multiplicity of criticisms. They come from various philosophical traditions, sometimes even opposing ones. You've got Marxism, psychoanalysis, speculative realism, analytical philosophy, all taking shots. You could picture it like criticisms coming from loads of different directions at once, like darts being thrown from every corner of the room, each from a different school of thought or tradition. Because Deleuze's work touches on and challenges so many different areas, he kind of opens himself up to attacks from all these angles simultaneously.
Yeah, and the diversity of these critiques is quite striking. The source notes that some critics, approaching from certain perspectives, might accuse him of idealism, the view that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual. Yet others, coming from different angles, might critique him for materialism, the view that reality is fundamentally physical matter, or maybe vitalism, which emphasizes some kind of non-physical life force. These conflicting accusations, sometimes even within the same critical report, really illustrate the divergent grounds upon which his work is attacked. It shows just how many different fundamental disagreements underlie the critiques.
And our source material navigates this complex, critical landscape, providing a detailed account of these perceived invalid aspects of Deleuze's work, as articulated by his critics. And that's exactly what we'll continue to do, using the report as our guide through this tangled web.
Okay, so moving on from the overall landscape, a really significant portion of the critical attacks targets not just the substance of Deleuze's philosophy, what he says about reality or concepts, but its form. This includes his writing style, his method of argumentation, and even his very definition of what philosophy is. These critiques often characterize his work as deliberately obscure, lacking in conventional argumentative rigor, and methodologically unsound, at least from a traditional standpoint.
Yeah, this is where those accusations of obscurity, jargon, and elitism really come to the fore. It's one of the most common and strongly expressed criticisms you hear. Many readers, even, seasoned philosophers, find his writing incredibly dense and jargon-laden. They describe it as convoluted, making text virtually inaccessible to a broad audience, or maybe even to specialists in other philosophical areas.
William F. Vallicella is a prominent voice raising this specific criticism. He decries what he calls the typically French flabbiness of thought and expression. That's quite a phrase. He argues that in this style of writing, the attempt to achieve a clever or showy or unique style actually drives the philosophical thought itself, meaning the priority is on achieving a certain literary or stylistic effect over clear, precise philosophical exposition. Vallicella sees coherence and argumentative clarity as secondary concerns, if they're concerns at all, and this prioritizing of style over substance is a cornerstone of his attack.
You can really almost hear the frustration in Vallicella's critique. Like, imagine someone throwing the book across the room and just shouting, "Just say what you mean," And this perceived obscurity isn't just about aesthetics. It's often directly linked to charges of elitism. Dave Harris, using a framework from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, argues quite directly that Deleuze's style is, quote, just elitist.
And Harris supports this by pointing to Deleuze's use of unending illusions that the vulgar do not perceive, meaning he constantly refers to things, thinkers, concepts, historical events that the average reader, or even a reader outside a very specific, highly educated intellectual circle, wouldn't recognize without extensive prior knowledge. He expects readers to possess considerable prior knowledge of the philosophical canon he's reinterpreting, as well as other fields. Such a style, critics argue, requires significant cultural capital, that accumulated knowledge and background that demonstrates one's intellectual competence and allows participation in certain cultural spaces. This effectively excludes or intimidates those not already initiated into a specific, specialized intellectual milieu.
Yeah, and this creates what the source describes as a performative contradiction. Deleuze himself critiqued what he called the school of intimidation, which manufactures specialists in thought. He aimed to dismantle the hegemony of thought, the dominance of certain ways of thinking or certain groups. Yet his own demanding style, which is full of this dizzying array of neologisms, newly invented terms like rhizomes, desiring machines, the body without organs, and an idiosyncratic, sometimes kind of perverse, use of existing technical terms. Well, it can be seen as creating new barriers to entry.
Exactly. Critics argue that understanding Deleuze's work effectively becomes a form of specialized knowledge in itself. It requires mastering his unique vocabulary and his particular interpretive approach. This, ironically, could be seen as fostering the very intellectual specialization and potential hegemony of thought he aimed to dismantle. Think about a term like rhizome, you can visualize it, like ginger or bamboo roots spreading horizontally without a single central point. It's an evocative image, sounds interesting, complex, but what does it mean philosophically? How does it function as a rigorous concept? The jargon itself becomes the barrier, making the ideas inaccessible unless you learn this new specific language.
And while some proponents acknowledge Deleuze's own assertion that philosophy must, at times, be uncommon and nonsensical to effectively shake us from the normative, to jar us out of conventional ways of thinking, critics argue this justification doesn't really excuse what they see as deliberate obscurity. They see such a style as deliberate obfuscation, making things unclear on purpose, rather than a necessary philosophical tool for radical thought.
The works Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, which he co-authored with Guattari, are frequently cited as prime examples of this deliberately delirious and disconnected writing style. This style, critics say, is meant to embody or demonstrate the free-floating, rhizomatic nature of thinking that Deleuze and Guattari describe, but it makes the actual texts incredibly challenging to follow or understand in a linear, argumentative way.
Okay, let's just quickly recap where we are then. We've just unpacked the criticisms focusing on how Deleuze writes and thinks. What were the main points there?
Well, we heard about his difficult, jargon-filled style, which critics call elitist because it seems to require specific cultural capital and a lot of prior knowledge. We also discussed the frustration expressed by critics like Vallicella, who feel he prioritizes creating new concepts or achieving a certain stylistic effect over building clear, logical arguments, arguments with discernible premises and conclusions that you could actually judge as true or false. These critics feel he's sort of redefined philosophy in a way that makes it hard to engage with critically, at least according to traditional standards.
Right. So moving beyond the style to the substance of the arguments themselves, Deleuze is also frequently criticized for a perceived lack of conventional argumentative structure, clarity, and rigor within his philosophical claims. Not just how he writes, but the logic inside.
Exactly. This concern about argumentation is what brings us back to Vallicella's famously exasperated demand. It really captures the frustration, particularly among those trained in analytical philosophical traditions that really value clear, step-by-step logic. He demands, be clear, say something definite, give an argument with discernible premises and conclusion. Stop your silly-ass posturing and name-dropping, say something that can be evaluated as either true or false. This just shows the strong desire from these critics for philosophical claims to be presented in a way that can be logically assessed and maybe even potentially falsified.
And Terence Blake argues that Deleuze did a lot of harm with his definition of philosophy as creation of concepts and his attitude of ignoring objections. Blake, while acknowledging Deleuze as a master of argumentation, in some sense, contends that Deleuze failed to sufficiently integrate it into his system of thought.
This failure, Blake suggests, leads to an environment conducive to what he describes as multiple inane monologues juxtaposed as if a discussion were taking place. Unner. The charge is that instead of systematically developed arguments, with clear premises and conclusions linking ideas logically, Deleuze often presents these evocative portraits or just bold assertions about concepts. This presentation style makes his claims difficult to assess according to standard logical criteria. It's hard to determine their truth or falsity in a conventional sense.
And this critique gets right to the heart of the clash between Deleuze's view of philosophy as creation of concepts versus the traditional emphasis on argumentation and truth-seeking. Deleuze's fundamental redefinition of philosophy's purpose is itself a major point of attack. He asserts that philosophers are creators and that each reading of philosophy ought to inspire new concepts. He famously stated quite directly, the philosopher creates, he doesn't reflect.
Right. And critics argue that this prioritization of conceptual creation, invention, novelty over traditional truth-seeking through argumentation, well, it undermines philosophy's critical capacity. As one commentator in the source material expressed it, such an approach is like a virus that kills our capacity to think critically and choosing one concept over another because it's better or more cogent or more humane or more closely corresponds to the world. They worry that if philosophy is just about creating whatever concepts you like, there's no real standard to judge them by, except maybe how aesthetically pleasing or novel they seem.
Yeah, and the Deleuzian notion that philosophical concepts can't just be easily extracted from their plane of immanence, the complex philosophical system and context where they live, and turn into simple statements for evaluation without seeming weak or just like opinions. Well, some critics view that as a kind of strategic evasion, a way to avoid rigorous critical scrutiny.
So this clash isn't just about how to argue, it's a deep metaphilosophical clash. It's a disagreement about what philosophy is for, what its primary goals should be. While Deleuzian defenders might argue that critics are applying inappropriate criteria rooted in old ways of thinking, to Deleuze's genuinely new project, the critics contend that Deleuze's redefinition of philosophy itself is problematic right from the start.
If philosophy abandons traditional argumentation and the pursuit of truth as its main goal, they argue, it risks losing its distinctive character and its critical function. It might become something else entirely, something other than philosophy in a recognizable sense. The prioritization of conceptual mobilization and effect, how a concept works and what it does philosophically, over propositional truth testing, whether a statement is actually true or false, that's a substantive point of philosophical disagreement. It's about the very aims and methods of the discipline. So, what's the core disagreement about the purpose of philosophy between Deleuze and his critics? Is it concept creation and effect, or truth and argumentation?
Okay, we've just unpacked the criticisms focusing on how Deleuze writes and thinks. What were the big points there?
We heard about his difficult, jargon-filled style, which critics call elitist because it requires specific cultural capital and prior knowledge. And we discussed the frustration expressed by critics who feel he seems to prioritize creating new concepts over building clear, logical arguments that can be judged as true or false, redefining philosophy in a way that makes traditional critical engagement difficult.
Let's do some flashcards covering these points on style and method. Flashcard 1. Critics like Vallicella say Deleuze's style is obscure, maybe even flabby, and lacks clear argumentative structure.
Yep.
Flashcard 2. Accusations of jargon and elitism from people like Harris suggest the style requires specific cultural capital and excludes many readers.
Why?
Flashcard 3. Critics argue Deleuze prioritizes the creation of concepts and stylistic effect over traditional truth-seeking and rigorous argumentation. That's Vallicella, Blake.
Makes sense.
Flashcard 4. This raises a metaphilosophical clash. A fundamental disagreement about what philosophy is for. Is it about effect and creation, or truth and argument?
That gives us a solid grasp of the critiques related to his style and method. Now let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at criticisms that target the very content of his philosophy, alleging internal incoherence, contradiction, and inconsistency within his ideas.
Right. These charges go beyond just how he writes and claim there are fundamental problems within the system itself, that the ideas don't logically hold together or they contradict each other. These range from general claims of, sloppy verbiage to really specific instances of alleged conceptual self-contradiction and unresolved tensions within his evolving body of work.
William F. Vallicella comes up again here, characterizing Deleuze's writing as an unholy and sloppy blend of verbiage that teases and frustrates more than it enlightens. He sees this as evidence of a fundamental lack of philosophical coherence.
He links this perceived flaw to what he calls a broader, typically French tendency, where philosophers, in his view, cannot decide whether they want to be philosophers or literary writers. He sees this indecision leading to a kind of hybrid form that lacks the clarity and coherence expected of traditional philosophy.
Similarly, the source mentions Vincent Descombes, who argues that Deleuze's account in Nietzsche and philosophy of difference not derived from identity is incoherent. The concept of difference existing purely on its own, being primary without being defined by something else that it differs from. Well, Descombes sees that as failing to hold together logically or conceptually.
Yeah, and we saw earlier that a Reddit commentator echoed these general dismissals, calling Deleuze and Guattari obscurantists and immanentists, whose work lacks substantive, coherent claims. They asserted quite strongly, I'm not sure D&G have anything substantive to say. You can imagine trying to build a complex machine where the parts are described with constantly shifting meanings and the assembly instructions contradict each other. It would be impossible to build a functioning structure. That's kind of the feeling these critics express.
Critics have also pointed to more specific instances of alleged contradiction within Deleuze's conceptual framework, moving from just general feelings of incoherence to pinpointing exact statements or conceptual relationships they find contradictory.
One example, again from Vallicella's critique of Deleuze's Nietzsche and philosophy, targets the statement, genealogy means both the value of origin and the origin of values.
Vallicella argues this statement comes close to contradicting Deleuze's own point on the preceding page. Because there, Deleuze states that the origin of values lies not in some inherent quality of values themselves, but in acts of evaluation performed by those judging, which are not values but ways of being, modes of existence, of those who judge and evaluate. Vallicella contends that by saying genealogy means both the value of origin and the origin of values, Deleuze creates confusion. He suggests, at the very least, this formulation suffers from unclarity and potentially contradicts his own preceding point about where values actually come from.
Another specific charge relates to Deleuze's stance on relative values. Deleuze asserts, genealogy is as opposed to absolute values as it is to relative or utilitarian ones. Vallicella deems this statement incoherent.
His reasoning is pretty straightforward. If values, according to Deleuze's own genealogical account, derive from the evaluator's modes of existence, their nobility or baseness, health or sickness, etc., then it seems obvious that values are necessarily relative to these evaluating beings. They depend on the specific being doing the evaluating and their state. Therefore, Vallicella argues, Deleuze's attempt to oppose relative values is seen as a self-contradictory effort, perhaps designed to be radical and shocking, but failing logically because it contradicts his own established framework for where values originate. It's like saying, I'm against both objective truth and subjective opinions. It seems contradictory if everything has to fall into one of those categories.
Right. Then there's the critique regarding Deleuze's own argument against the primacy of contradiction. Deleuze argues strongly against the ontological primacy of contradiction, the idea that contradiction is fundamental to the nature of reality itself, like in Hegel's dialectic, where conflict drives development. Deleuze prefers a metaphysics of difference, where difference is primary and doesn't just arise from opposition or contradiction.
But some critics question whether his own complex dynamic system successfully avoids internal contradictions when judged by traditional logical standards. For instance, a Reddit user, cited in the source, queried how Deleuze's ontology, if it truly differs from Hegel's supposedly presuppositionless system, could avoid accidentally involving presuppositions. The implication is that if Hegel's dialectical system is correct in being presuppositionless, then Deleuze's system, which rejects contradiction, might be mistaken and does involve unacknowledged starting assumptions that could lead to contradictions down the line.
Yeah, and another user in the same discussion countered that Deleuze, in turn, appears to presuppose things he might not intend to. Specifically, they argue he seems to presuppose A, the logical concepts used to analyze this pure difference, the tools he uses to talk about difference, and 2, the givenness of empirical experience, which is always subject to skeptical doubt. So even in trying to build a system of pure difference, he relies on logical tools and basic experience that might themselves be seen as fundamental presuppositions, potentially undermining his claim of starting from pure difference.
It's worth noting, as the source points out, that many of these accusations of incoherence arise from applying classical logic and traditional philosophical expectations, like stable definitions and linear argumentation, to a thinker whose fundamental project involves challenging these very norms. Deleuze works with concepts like difference in itself and the dynamic becoming of concepts, which inherently resist being pinned down in the way traditional logic might demand.
Exactly. The perceived incoherence often highlights a deep incompatibility between Deleuze's philosophical methodology and that of his critics. From a Deleuzian standpoint, what critics label as incoherence might be interpreted as a necessary feature of a philosophy striving to articulate difference and becoming rather than a flaw to be corrected.
Nevertheless, that defense doesn't just negate the critical argument that such a system may prove difficult for rational engagement or fail to meet established criteria of philosophical adequacy. If the work is intended to be philosophy, critics argue, it must be subject to philosophical standards of clarity and coherence, even if those standards are being pushed or redefined. It can't just evade judgment altogether.
A significant line of defense against these charges of inconsistency comes from commentators who emphasize Deleuze's notion of the continuous variation of concepts.
Daniel W. Smith is a key figure here. He argues that apparent inconsistencies are not logical failings, but are integral to the continuous variation of concepts as they evolve over time and in response to different problems. Smith illustrates this using Deleuze's concept of intensity.
He shows how the meaning of intensity evolves across different works, like Difference and Repetition, Logic of Sense, Anti-Oedipus, and What is Philosophy? But it doesn't evolve randomly. It evolves in response to new problematics or philosophical problems Deleuze is addressing at the time. Smith's point is that there is a consistency to a concept like intensity, but consistency is not the same as identity. Concepts don't remain static. They change because the philosophical problems they are designed to solve or engage with change.
So this perspective reframes apparent contradictions not as logical failings, but as integral features of a philosophy in a perpetual state of becoming. Concepts naturally undergo internal mutations and variations as the thought develops and applies itself to new domains.
However, while this defense is internally consistent with Deleuze's broader philosophy of becoming, it is susceptible to external critique. Critics may argue that continuous variation just serves as a convenient rationalization for a lack of systematic rigor, a way to explain away problems.
Or they might argue that such conceptual fluidity renders Deleuze's system basically unfalsifiable and too elusive for coherent critical engagement. If the meanings of core concepts can shift substantially across different works without explicit redefinition or clear rules guiding that transformation, it can legitimately lead to perceptions of inconsistency. And it makes it exceedingly difficult to identify stable points for critique.
Right. So the very mechanism that explains conceptual change within Deleuze's system can thus be viewed by detractors as a way to evade charges of inconsistency. This contributes to the frustration expressed by critics like Pascal Engel, who argued that Deleuze's metaphilosophy, his philosophy about philosophy, makes it impossible to reasonably disagree with a philosophical system. If the terms can always shift, how can you ever pin down a disagreement and debate it properly?
There's also a specific structural inconsistency identified by Slavoj Žižek, drawing on the work of Manuel de Landa. He posits a central tension, or even contradiction, between what he calls Deleuze the sick, the solo works like Logic of Sense and Difference and Repetition, and Deleuze the second, the work done as the Deleuze-Guattarian duo in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus.
And the crux of this alleged contradiction lies in the causal role of the virtual. Now, in philosophy, the virtual isn't like virtual reality. It's something real but not yet actualized, like a realm of potentiality. According to Žižek's reading for Deleuze the virtuality becoming, particularly the sense event, the meaning or effect that happens on the surface, distinct from physical causes, is largely a passive, causally sterile effect of actual bodily material causes and processes. It's an effect that arises from the actual world, not a cause of it.
Okay, but then in contrast, for Deleuze too, Žižek argues, the realm of virtual singularities and the flux of pure becoming transforms into the productive cause of individuated bodies and subjects within diverse concrete assemblages. Here, the virtual isn't just an effect, it's what produces actual bodies and subjects and the structures they inhabit. It's the source.
Exactly. This apparent shift in the causal power of the virtual, from a passive effect arising from the actual world to an active, productive cause of the actual world, represents a significant point of alleged inconsistency for Žižek. It's not just, a subtle variation in conceptual nuance, but a fundamental reversal in the attributed causal direction of one of Deleuze's core metaphysical concepts. Such a substantial change, if it's not explicitly accounted for and justified philosophically within the texts, could indeed be seen as a major inconsistency or an unacknowledged rupture within Deleuze's overall system. One that Žižek feels isn't easily explained away just by saying continuous variation.
Right.
What is the alleged difference between Deleuze and Deleuze II, according to Žižek, regarding the virtual's causal power?
Okay, we've just finished exploring the accusations that Deleuze's actual ideas suffer from internal incoherence and contradiction. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, we saw those general claims that his ideas are a sloppy blend, lacking coherent claims. We also looked at specific alleged contradictions, like his statements on values, and whether his system truly avoids contradictions compared to someone like Hegel.
Right, and we discussed the defense that his concepts undergo continuous variation, but how critics argue this just makes the work too slippery, too difficult to pin down. Plus, that specific tension Žižek identifies regarding the causal role of the virtual between Deleuze's earlier and later works.
Okay, let's do some flashcards summarizing these points about incoherence. Flashcard 1. Critics like Vallicella argue Deleuze's concepts are incoherent, often linking it to unclear expression or style.
Got it.
Flashcard 2. Specific contradictions are alleged regarding statements on the value of origin versus the origin of values and his opposition to relative values. Flashcard 3. Critics question if his system truly avoids contradiction, especially when contrasted with Hegel's dialectic.
Right.
Flashcard 4. Defenders argue continuous variation explains conceptual shifts, but critics say this evades critique and makes the system unfalsifiable. Flashcard 5. Žižek claims a significant inconsistency in the virtual's causal role between Deleuze's solo works, Deleuze the first, and his collaborative works, Deleuze the second.
That helps clarify the complex claims about incoherence. Now let's shift gears to a really significant and often contentious aspect of Deleuze's philosophical output. His extensive engagement with the history of philosophy. He wrote numerous books specifically on canonical figures, Hume, Kant, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, and he deeply reinterpreted their ideas.
Yeah. And the crucial point here, as the source notes, is that his approach to these thinkers was far from traditional exegesis. Exegesis means, a neutral, straightforward explanation of an author's original ideas based strictly on the text and historical context. His approach was very different, and this unorthodox approach leads to accusations that his interpretations were less acts of scholarly fidelity, faithfulness to the original text and intent, and more instances of creative and sometimes distorting appropriation, taking them for his own ends.
Deleuze himself was actually quite open, even provocative, about his method for reading past philosophers. He described his work on them not as a neutral reflection or reproduction of their ideas, but akin to portraiture and painting. His aim, he said, was to produce a likeness in a different material. This suggests the interpreter isn't just passively reflecting the original, but actively transforming the material in their own style to create something new that captures a perceived essence. You can imagine a painter capturing the spirit of a person, but doing it in their own unique artistic style, maybe emphasizing certain features or changing the background entirely. It's recognizable, but it's distinctly the painter's interpretation and work, not just a photograph.
Right. And more provocatively, and perhaps infamously, Deleuze characterized his method as a sort of buggery or immaculate conception. He explained this involved taking an author from behind and giving him a child that would be his own offspring, yet monstrous. This graphic language really highlights the non-traditional, maybe even violent nature of his approach from a scholarly perspective. It's not respectful engagement. It's an act that produces something new and different, potentially distorted from the original parent.
And while claiming to restrict himself to what an author actually says, Deleuze admitted to focusing on their shifting, slipping, dislocations, and hidden emissions, the less obvious, perhaps even unconscious or undeveloped aspects of their thought, the points of tension or potential that weren't fully expressed. He used these to produce these monstrous yet supposedly authentic conceptual children. He wasn't just looking for the stated arguments, but for the underlying forces or movements in their work that he could then develop.
Such an avowedly transformative approach is, as you might expect, inherently controversial and a major source of criticism. It directly challenges the conventional scholarly virtues that philosophy departments and historians of philosophy often really value: interpretive fidelity, historical accuracy, understanding a text within its original context.
So while Deleuze might have seen this method as revealing deeper, unarticulated potentials within a philosopher's work potentials, the original author might not have even fully grasped themselves. Critics often see it very differently. They see it as a license for misinterpretation, for anachronism, reading present ideas back into the past where they weren't, or simply the imposition of Deleuze's own philosophical agenda onto historical figures, basically making them say what he wants them to say.
The critiques in this domain are therefore not merely about minor disagreements over textual details or, different valid interpretations that are within the realm of normal scholarship. They often question the very legitimacy of Deleuze's entire hermeneutic strategy, his whole approach to interpretation. His method is sometimes seen as an unfair argument because it appears to change the established rules of scholarly engagement with the philosophical tradition. It makes it difficult to critique him on standard historical or interpretive grounds because he's not playing by those rules.
Okay, let's dive into the critiques of his readings of specific philosophers using the details provided in the source material we have. First up, Immanuel Kant. Deleuze wrote a book titled Kant's Critical Philosophy and engaged deeply with Kant's three major critiques.
Deleuze's reading emphasizes what he sees as Kant's rejections of transcendentality in favor of a generalized pragmatism of reason. Now, simplified transcendentality for you if you're new to philosophy. In Kant's philosophy, it roughly relates to the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge or experience. These conditions often involve the innate structures of the mind itself, like our concepts of space and time, or categories of understanding which shape how we perceive and understand the world. They're kind of like the operating system of the mind. Immanence, on the other hand, roughly means staying within or operating within a given plane or reality without appealing to external, higher, or separate principles. Everything happens on one level. Deleuze argues that even Kant's transcendental faculties, these mental structures that condition experience, act only in an immanent fashion to achieve their own ends, which is a controversial reading, emphasizing process over fixed structure in Kant.
Stephen Shaviro, who's often sympathetic to Deleuze, notes that Deleuze's own philosophy, which he calls transcendental empiricism, is heavily indebted to a selective, transformative reading of Kant's transcendental idealism. Deleuze famously called Kant an enemy, suggesting a fundamental opposition between their projects, yet he also credited him with 4 revolutionary poetic formulas acknowledging Kant's innovative aspects. So, it's a complex relationship.
Right. And while much commentary focuses on explaining Deleuze's unique reinterpretation of Kant, for example, shifting the focus from Kant's conditions of possible experience, what could we possibly experience given our mental structure, to the conditions of real experience, what actually happens in reality and how does it shape us, and critiquing Kant's paradigm of recognition, where we fit things into existing categories, the very act of Deleuze claiming to complete what Kant left unfinished, or significantly revising Kant's philosophy. Well, that can be viewed as producing one of his monstrous offspring.
Critics could argue that Deleuze's insistence on finding immanence within Kant's system fundamentally misrepresents the crucial role of transcendental structures and the constituting subject, the thinking self that actively organizes experience, in Kant's philosophy. The claim that Kantian faculties operate only in an immanent fashion is particularly vulnerable to the charge of being an unfair reading. It seems to force Kant into Deleuze's preferred philosophical framework, which is focused on immanence and process, rather than understanding Kant on his own terms, where the distinction between the transcendental and the empirical is absolutely central. So how does Deleuze's reading of Kant differ from traditional interpretations, and what is the core criticism of his approach? Is it about immanence versus transcendence?
Okay, next. Baruch Spinoza. Deleuze's interpretation of Spinoza, particularly in expressionism and philosophy. Spinoza was hugely influential. It contributed to what became known as political Spinozism. His reading emphasizes Spinoza's concepts of expressionism, the idea that everything expresses the being of God or nature, which Spinoza saw as the same thing, and absolute immanence, the idea that everything exists and operates entirely within a single reality, without a transcendent God or a separate higher realm.
The source mentions an article, The Delirium of Rationalism, which explains that Deleuze invokes Spinoza and Leibniz, another rationalist philosopher, because he sees their delirious rationalism, a form of rationalism that goes beyond typical limited bounds, as undermining the model of representation. He thought they did this by critiquing generality and conflating essence and existence. Basically, they saw individual things as directly expressing the universal nature of reality, rather than just representing it in a limited or mediated way.
However, Peter Hallward, as relayed by Shaviro, offers a really harsh critique of the implications of Deleuze's Spinozism, rather than focusing solely on the interpretive fidelity to Spinoza's text. He polemically portrays Deleuze as a Stalin or Hitler of the virtual, using incredibly strong, even shocking political language based on an interpretation where the more absolute the sovereign's power, the more free are those subject to it. This is a point Hallward takes from his reading of Deleuze's engagement with Spinoza's ideas on power. This is a critique of the political outcome of Deleuze's reading, suggesting it leads to politically untenable or even dangerous conclusions. It's less a direct critique of whether he read Spinoza correctly. Though traditional Spinoza scholars might also view Deleuze's intense focus on expressionism and its connection to a delirious rationalism as an overemphasis on certain aspects of Spinoza's thought, or maybe an anachronistic projection of Deleuze's own philosophical concerns back onto Spinoza.
Right. Moving on to Friedrich Nietzsche. Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy is a crucial text for understanding Deleuze's own system. He was heavily influenced by his reading of Nietzsche. But Stephen Shaviro accuses Deleuze of systematizing Nietzsche's thought to a remarkable extent, an extent that Nietzsche himself never reached and would most likely have actively scorned.
Yeah, this critique is based on Nietzsche's own famous dictum. The will to a system is a lack of integrity. Nietzsche was famously against building rigid philosophical systems. He favored aphorisms, essays, more fragmented writing styles. So the charge here is that Deleuze misrepresents Nietzsche by imposing a systematic structure onto a thinker who is explicitly anti-systematic. A little mnemonic, Nietzsche said, no system. Critics say Deleuze ignored this key aspect of Nietzsche's philosophical approach and personality.
Conversely, some commentators, like the author of a blog post cited in the source, present Deleuze's Nietzsche as uncompromised, anti-dialectic, and anti-Hegelian. They frame this interpretation as a necessary reparation to Nietzsche, meaning fixing previous misunderstandings that had kind of domesticated his thought, made it less radical. Randall S. M. Reyes characterizes Deleuze's method as a minoritarian reading and a creative struggle, acknowledging its departure from literal interpretation, but framing it positively as producing something new and valuable.
But a particularly contentious point within the Nietzsche reading is Deleuze's interpretation of the eternal return. This is one of Nietzsche's most famous, difficult, and enigmatic ideas. Kari Burchat's thesis directly accuses Deleuze of misinterpreting this concept.
Burchat argues that Deleuze's assertion of an eternal return of the different, the idea that things come back, but always with a subtle difference or variation each time, is just not supported by Nietzsche's texts. She claims Nietzsche's texts consistently emphasize a recurrence of the same events for the Overman, Nietzsche's concept of a goal for humanity. This critique is echoed in a Reddit discussion cited in the source, where users argue that Deleuze castrates, a strong metaphor meaning he fundamentally weakens, changes, or removes something essential from Nietzsche's idea. He removes the psychological challenge of affirming the return of the same suffering and joy, the identical events. The difficult world-affirming challenge for Nietzsche, they argue, was precisely in willing the return of the identical, not something subtly different or varied.
Exactly. The accusation is that Deleuze's claim to present a truer Nietzschean, who is anti-Hegelian and systematically coherent, is actually an imposition of Deleuze's own philosophical agenda. This is seen as a clear instance of producing a monstrous offspring, where the new concept created by Deleuze isn't truly Nietzschean, but a product of Deleuze's own thought, just wearing Nietzsche's name. Picture Nietzsche's idea as the exact same moment repeating forever, an exact loop. Now, picture Deleuze's version, where it's always slightly different each time it comes back. The critique is that Deleuze changed something absolutely fundamental about the difficult affirmation Nietzsche intended.
Okay, finally, Henri Bergson. The Xenogothic blog post titled The Endurance of Bergsonism and the Missteps of Deleuzian Buggery offers an explicit critique of Deleuze's Bergsonism. The author argues that Deleuze commits a misstep by imposing a structure of progression and distinct stages, duration, memory, élan vital, life force, onto Bergson's philosophy.
Right. This interpretive move is labeled an anti-Bergsonian gambit that comes at the price of faithfulness to the real duration and lived development of Bergson's philosophy. Bergson's key concept of duration emphasizes continuous, indivisible flow and change, where there are no distinct stages but a constant becoming. Deleuze is accused of adopting a retrospective vision that sees movement only in terms of the destination it reaches. This is exactly the kind of spatialized thinking about time, thinking of time like points on a line, which misses the flow that Bergson himself consistently problematized in contrast to pure duration.
Furthermore, Deleuze has pushed past Bergson's analysis of subjective human experience towards an inhuman or superhuman register of duration. Thinking about duration outside of human experience is seen as unfaithful to Bergson's persistently vitalist humanism. Bergson's focus on life and human experience is fundamental.
A critique in the Notre Dame Philosophical Review of a book on Deleuze's Bergsonism similarly suggests that Deleuze's focus on novelty and invention might overshadow Bergson's more practical and ethical aims, and his emphasis on divergent lines of evolution might neglect Bergson's crucial insight into the interconnectedness of life. Imposing a linear, stage-based structure on Bergson, a philosopher renowned for his concept of continuous, flowing duration, is highlighted as a significant point of alleged distortion or misinterpretation. It's like describing a flowing river by only focusing on specific points along the bank, ignoring the continuous, smooth movement and interconnectedness of the water itself.
So the broader criticism here, extending beyond just these individual interpretations, is that Deleuze consistently uses past philosophers as mere conduits for his own conceptual creations, rather than genuinely engaging with them on their own terms. They become tools for his own philosophical building project.
Exactly. A commentator on the Partially Examined Life podcast articulated this frustration really vividly. They said, teaching Plato as Deleuze or Austin as Deleuze is just as bad as a Christian ideologue teaching, say, Tolstoy as an illustration of the truth that Christ is Lord without explaining that this is Hischer presupposition. It's imposing his philosophical framework on us. It's dishonest. This highlights a fundamental concern that Deleuze's historical engagements are less about genuine dialogue and understanding the original thinker, and more about a form of philosophical ventriloquism, making past philosophers speak Deleuze's ideas for his own purposes. The criticism is essentially that he's not reading them to understand them, but using them to talk about his own ideas, almost as if they are saying what he wants them to say, which critics find intellectually dishonest.
And the act of systematizing thinkers who actively resisted systematization, like Nietzsche, reveals a potential tension within Deleuze's own project. While championing difference, flux, and the singularity of concepts within their own plane of immanence, his interpretive practice can be seen as imposing a form of conceptual order, a molar organization, to use a Deleuzian term for large-scale, rigid structures that the original thinker might have vehemently rejected.
Right. This act of systematization, even if intended to make a philosopher useful for Deleuze's own creative purposes or to reveal a hidden systematicity, could be viewed by critics as a form of philosophical violence, one that contradicts his stated emphasis on respecting the unique contours of another's thought and celebrating difference.
Wow, okay, that's a deep dive into how critics see Deleuze's way of reading other philosophers.
Yeah.
It's clearly very controversial territory. What were the main takeaways from that section?
Well, the core issue is his highly creative method, which he even called buggery or portraiture. Critics argue this isn't faithful interpretation, but rather him imposing his own ideas onto figures like Kant, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Spinoza, creating what he called monstrous offspring, but which critics see as outright distortions or misrepresentations, like changing Nietzsche's eternal return or imposing stages onto Bergson's idea of duration.
Okay, let's do some flashcards on Deleuze's interpretations of other philosophers. Flashcard 1. Deleuze's method is portraiture, or biggery, aiming for monstrous offspring rather than traditional fidelity.
Right.
Flashcard 2. Critics argue this method allows him to impose his own framework, distorting thinkers like Kant, finding immanence, Nietzsche, systematizing him, changing eternal return, and Bergson, imposing stages. Flashcard 3. The general charge is that he uses past philosophers as conduits for his own ideas, which some critics call dishonest.
Exactly. So it's not just reading differently, but reading in a way that critics feel violates the original thinker's intent or method. Now, moving on, Deleuze's philosophy, with its radical departures from established norms, has inevitably drawn fire from various rival philosophical schools and thinkers working from different core beliefs. These critiques often stem from fundamental disagreements about methodology, core metaphysical commitments, and importantly, political implications.
Right. From the Marxist tradition, critiques of Deleuze and Guattari have been pretty persistent. Theorists of the Frankfurt School, for example, that group of thinkers who developed critical social theory, often analyzing power in society, they're generally considered implicitly incompatible with Deleuze and Guattari's thought. More broadly, traditional Marxists often critique Deleuze through a Hegelian lens, leveraging the materialist aspects of Marxism against post-structuralist thought, and they kind of scoff at his often dismissive attitude towards Hegel, whose dialectic is foundational for Marxist philosophy.
Yeah, and a pointed accusation came from Henri Lefebvre, a prominent Marxist sociologist and philosopher. He criticized Deleuze and Guattari for what he saw as hypocrisy in accepting research contracts from academic institutions. Lefebvre argued that by doing so, they were effectively helping empire recuperate radical thought, meaning they were allowing powerful institutions representing the dominant system to take radical ideas and neutralize their critical edge, integrating them into the very systems they ostensibly opposed. It's like a revolutionary artist taking money from the government. Critics would say it compromises their radical message and blunts its impact by becoming part of the establishment.
And Alain Badiou, another major contemporary French philosopher, during his earlier Maoist phase, a period where he was influenced by Maoist political thought, emphasizing disciplined collective action, also launched a significant attack. He attacked Deleuze's valorization of rhizomatic desire, that idea of desire as a spreading, non-hierarchical, decentralized force. In an anonymously published polemic titled The Fascism of the Potato, Badiou expressed concern. He feared that Deleuze's emphasis on anarchic, proliferating desires would divert revolutionary energy into individualistic bourgeois channels, rather than fostering the disciplined, collective political action necessary for revolution.
This critique highlights a fundamental tension between Deleuzean notions of micropolitics, focusing on power dynamics and resistance at a local, individual level, and desire as a productive force, versus more traditional Marxist conceptions of revolutionary organization and praxis, which emphasize unified, collective action aimed at structural change on a large scale. Think of rhizomatic desire, like roots spreading everywhere in a tangled, non-centralized way, creating many dispersed points of growth. Badiou, in this critique, wanted a unified, directed force, like a single strong pre-trunk pushing upwards, representing organized, collective power.
Now, Deleuze and Guattari's collaborative work, Anti-Oedipus, mounted a direct assault on Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, the major schools of psychological theory stemming from Freud. So inevitably, this provoked strong rebuttals from the psychoanalytic camp.
Yeah, psychoanalytic theorists whose foundational concepts like the Oedipus complex, the unconscious desires and rivalries involving parents and psychic representation, how the mind represents reality, were directly challenged, while they naturally feel attacked by the whole idea of anti-Oedipus.
Greg Lambert's book, Who's Afraid of Deleuze and Guattari, explores this critical reception. It notes how Deleuze and Guattari were particularly critical of the way Lacanian psychoanalysis had, in their view, become a rigid interpretation machine, a system for interpreting everything through a predetermined framework, especially the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety. While Lambert's work often defends Deleuze and Guattari's intentions, its very existence testifies to the intense negative reaction their critique generated within that field.
More direct criticisms come from figures like Anthony Elliot, who, as cited in the source material, deems schizoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattari's term, for their alternative to psychoanalysis, drawing loosely on ideas about schizophrenia as a process of breaking down fixed structures to be fatally flawed.
Elliot argues that Deleuze and Guattari make false emancipatory claims for schizophrenia, suggesting that processes associated with severe mental illness could be a path to liberation. Critics see this as clinically irresponsible and potentially harmful. He also argues they offer a reductive view of the individual, seeing people merely as an assemblage of organs, intensities, and flows, like different functional parts and energies, rather than a complex, contradictory identity shaped by history, language, and the unconscious, as in psychoanalysis. Further discussions among psychoanalytically informed commentators suggest that Deleuze and Guattari's interpretation of schizophrenia and anti-Oedipus is often viewed as a rhetorical weapon, aimed primarily at attacking Freud and Lacan rather than being a clinically informed psychiatric intervention grounded in the reality of mental illness. Critics argue that D&G selectively engaged with psychoanalytic literature, largely ignoring the broader body of work on schizophrenia to focus on specific texts like Freud's analysis of the Schreiber case, a famous analysis of a paranoid patient. They claim this leads to misrepresenting the complexity and internal evolution of psychoanalytic thought on psychosis. The charge is that their schizo is a philosophical construct used for argumentative purposes, not a clinically accurate or ethical representation of mental illness. What is a key psychoanalytic critique of Deleuze and Guattari's ideas in Anti-Oedipus? Focus on the view of the individual in schizophrenia.
Right, and then you have Slavoj Žižek, who has emerged as one of Deleuze's most prominent and persistent contemporary critics. He launches this multifaceted attack from a perspective that combines insights from Hegel, known for dialectics and grand systems based on contradiction, and Lacan, the psychoanalyst, focused on language, lack, and the symbolic order. His critique is notably laid out in his book Organs Without Bodies, on Deleuze and Consequences.
Žižek's critique operates on several levels. First, he questions the sincerity and coherence of Deleuze's violent rejection of Hegelian dialectic. Deleuze positioned himself strongly against Hegel, making his philosophy seem like a direct alternative. But Žižek provocatively suggests that this antipathy actually conceals a secret complicity with Hegel. He even frames Deleuze's refusal to engage dialectically with Hegel as a kind of incest prohibition, suggesting a hidden philosophical kinship between them that's being repressed or denied. For Žižek, Deleuze's non-dialectical thinking of the new, his focus on pure difference and becoming outside of Hegelian processes of opposition and synthesis, ultimately resolves into an idiosyncratic dialectical repetition of the same. It's like two siblings who fight constantly, but only because they are so similar underneath, constantly replaying similar dynamics even in their opposition. Žižek also scrutinizes Deleuze's key concepts of the virtual and the actual and becoming and being. He argues that these concepts, central to Deleuze's metaphysics, merely recapitulate the traditional philosophical instability between idealism, prioritizing mind, and materialism, prioritizing matter, rather than offering a truly new way of thinking about reality. And again, as we mentioned earlier, he specifically points to that alleged contradiction between an early Deleuze the first, where the virtual is a passive effect, and a later Deleuze the second with Guattari, where the virtual becomes a productive cause.
A particularly pointed part of Žižek's critique is political. He is highly critical of the political implications of Deleuze-Guattarian thought. He argues that their emphasis on micropolitics and deterritorialized flows movements and changes that break down fixed boundaries and territories ends up reflecting, rather than resisting, the deterritorialized flows of global capitalism.
In a particularly strong accusation, Žižek labels the Deleuze of anti-Oedipus an ideologist of late capitalism. This means he believes Deleuze's philosophy, especially its focus on desire and flows, far from being revolutionary, inadvertently aligns with and legitimizes contemporary capitalist dynamics. Capitalism also thrives on constant flow, change, and deterritorialization, breaking down traditional structures for its own purposes. So here's a board question idea for you. How does Žižek argue that Deleuze's thought, despite appearing radical, might actually support capitalism?
Yeah, and Shaviro also notes that Žižek's fundamental dislike for Deleuze stems partly from the absence of absolute opposition and pure negativity in Deleuze's thought. These are concepts that are very important in Hegelian and Lacanian philosophy, which see conflict, lack, and negation as fundamental driving forces in reality and thought. Deleuze focuses more on affirmation and difference.
Alain Badiou, another major figure in contemporary French philosophy, offers a distinct but equally forceful critique of Deleuze, particularly in his work Deleuze, The Clamor of Being. Badiou's central thesis is a radical reinterpretation of Deleuze's entire philosophical project. He argues Deleuze is not who he seems to be.
Right. Contrary to the popular image of Deleuze as a thinker of multiplicity and Dionysian becoming, emphasizing plurality, change, chaotic energy, Badiou argues that Deleuze is at heart an ascetic philosopher of being and oneness, a bit of a mnemonic. Badiou says Deleuze is secretly one, not many.
He contends that Deleuze's self-proclaimed anti-Platonism, His opposition to the philosophical traditions stemming from Plato, which often emphasizes ideal forms and fixed identities separate from the material world, ultimately fails, or is perhaps even a mischaracterization of his deeper philosophical commitments. Badiou posits that Deleuze's philosophy, in its essence, exhibits a metaphysics of the one, whose essential monotony is ultimately indifferent to the differences it generates. For Badiou, despite all the talk of difference and multiplicity, Deleuze's system ultimately collapses everything back into a single, undifferentiated being, which he sees as fundamentally Platonic or Parmenidean, referencing an ancient Greek philosopher of the one. Badiou also offers a refutation of Deleuzean vitalism and the concept of the event. He attempts to axiomatize, to formalize using logical or mathematical axioms, Deleuze's philosophy, particularly as found in Logic of Sense. He does this in order to subtract its formal core and thereby refute what he sees as Deleuzean vitalism, the emphasis on life, process, and force as primary. A key point of disagreement concerns the concept of the event and its relation to being. For Deleuze, the event, a sudden transformative occurrence that happens on the surface, emerges from a virtual chaotic plane of being. Badiou, in stark contrast, asserts that beneath the event, beneath becoming, there is an inconsistent void. This positions Badiou's mathematical ontology, a view of reality based on mathematical structures, particularly set theory against Deleuze's more vitalist or processual ontology. Badiou argues for emptiness instead of creative potential at the base of reality.
Similar to Zizek, Badiou criticizes the lack of theoretical autonomy for politics in Deleuze's work. Unlike art, science, and philosophy, which Deleuze treats as distinct domains of thought with their own principles, Badiou argues that politics in Deleuze's system lacks this independent theoretical grounding.
This perceived deficiency, for Badiou, leaves Deleuzean politics susceptible to uncritical spontaneity or anarcho-desirant tendencies, meaning tendencies towards undirected anarchy driven by desire, lacking the discipline and theoretical structure necessary for genuine political transformation. It's worth noting, though, that some commentators, like John Roff, argue that Badiou commits hermeneutical error in his reading of Deleuze, for instance, by mischaracterizing Deleuze's concepts of the actual and the virtual.
Peter Hallward, in his influential critique Out of This World, Deleuze and the Philosophy of Creation, presents Deleuze as a spiritual and extraworldly philosopher.
Hallward's central argument is that Deleuze's philosophy is fundamentally animated by the equation being is creativity, leading to an ontology, a theory of being, of absolute creation that is fundamentally out of this world.
He accuses Deleuze of a subtractive vitalism. The ultimate goal of Deleuzean philosophy in this reading is to escape the actual, the existing world as we experience it, and the creatural, the state of being a created being with limitations. This escape happens by pursuing lines of flight or making a body without organs. These are concepts Deleuze uses to describe processes of breaking away from fixed structures and identities.
According to Hallward, this escape aims to recover a pure, virtual creative force, a realm of potentiality detached from concrete reality. This constitutes a movement out of this world. Deleuze is thus portrayed as a philosopher of the virtual, whose primary aim is to escape and to destroy the actual. Imagine someone trying to float away from the earth, leaving everything physical and concrete behind, seeking a realm of pure possibility above or beyond it. Hallward sees Deleuze's philosophy as trying to do this conceptually, leaving the actual world behind for a realm of pure potential.
Right. Consequently, Hallward argues that Deleuze's philosophy leaves little room for processes of social or historical transformation, and still less for political relations of conflict or solidarity. His political thought, therefore, amounts to little more than utopian distraction, rendering his work essentially indifferent to the politics of this world, the real struggles for power and change happening on the ground among actual people and institutions.
Stephen Shaviro has strongly contested Hallward's interpretation, deeming it a fundamentally one-sided assassination attempt that misuses Deleuze's own interpretive methods to render him politically irrelevant. Shaviro emphasizes Deleuze's engagement with capitalism and the reciprocal determination between the virtual and the actual meaning. They mutually influence each other and cannot be separated. Aspects he claims Hallward ignores in favor of a one-sided reading, emphasizing only the escape to the virtual.
François Laruelle, a former student of Deleuze, offers a unique critique from the standpoint of what he calls non-philosophy. Laruelle argues that even Deleuze's radical philosophy of immanence, his emphasis on reality being contained within itself without transcendence, remains captive to what Laruelle terms the principle of sufficient philosophy, or the philosophical decision.
According to Laruelle, All standard philosophy, including Deleuze's, maintains a transcendent posture relative to the real, the ultimate nature of reality which it claims to grasp, define, or organize through its concepts and systems. Even though Deleuze champions immanence and multiplicity, Laruelle argues he ultimately remains a philosopher who legislates from a position of transcendence. He explains the real through his own conceptual architectonics, his system of concepts like the virtual and actual, the body without organs, rhizomes, etc., rather than truly enacting an egalitarian immanence. That would mean thinking from the real itself, in its radical givenness, rather than about it from a philosophical distance.
Non-philosophy, by contrast, seeks to think from the real, conceived as radically immanent and resistant to philosophical decision-making and definition, rather than merely about it. Laruelle's critique extends to philosophies of difference, including Deleuze's, accusing them of still reducing the real to the limits and constructs of philosophical thought. They are still imposing philosophical categories onto something that precedes philosophical definition.
Ray Bressier, a key figure in the speculative realism movement, advances a critique rooted in eliminative materialism, the view that mental states are ultimately physical phenomena, and a robust scientific realism, the view that scientific theories accurately describe reality itself, independent of human perception. In Nihil Unbound, Bressier confronts what he sees as continental philosophy's tendency to shield meaning from the threat of nihilism, the belief that life is without objective meaning.
He critiques the speculative excesses, latent and not so latent idealism and anthropomorphism prevalent in this tradition, meaning using abstract speculation, hidden idealism, prioritizing mind over matter, and anthropomorphism, attributing human qualities to non-human things to preserve meaning in a way that he sees as unscientific or philosophically weak. This critique would implicitly include Deleuze.
Bressier's project involves integrating eliminative materialism with speculative realism, a stance that would naturally lead to a critique of Deleuzian concepts such as vitalism, emphasizing life force, the virtual, if interpreted as a non-material realm, and the inherent productivity of desire. From his materialist and scientific realist perspective, these might seem too speculative, idealistic, or anthropocentric.
He challenges the philosophical privileging of time and making time fundamental to reality, and the meaningfulness of death found in thinkers like Heidegger and Nietzsche. These critiques could readily be extended to Deleuze, given his own Bergsonian and Nietzschean inheritances, which emphasize time, duration, becoming, and the role of death or finitude. Some commentators, however, argue that Bressier willfully misreads thought in Deleuze's work, incorrectly tying it to a Kantian subject, and thus wrongly accusing Deleuze of correlationism, the philosophical idea that we only ever have access to the correlation between mind and world, not the world in itself. This is the very position speculative realism seeks to overcome.
Manfred Frank, in What is Neo-Structuralism, offers a critique of post-structuralist thinkers, whom he terms neo-structuralists, including Deleuze, Foucault, and Derrida. While acknowledging their shared distaste for the metaphysical concepts of domination and system, their opposition to grand systems and oppressive traditional structures, Frank is troubled by what he perceives as an amoral celebration of the death of the subject within their work. They reject the idea of a fixed, central, autonomous self, which Frank finds problematic from an ethical standpoint.
Frank identifies ambiguities and contradictions in their treatment of the subject and metaphysics. He argues that these thinkers initially rejected such concepts with great fanfare, only to reintroduce them later or rely on them implicitly. Specifically concerning Deleuze, Frank notes that in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze posits that true philosophy is ontology, the study of being, and that being is univocal, meaning existence is said in a single sense across all differences. In Frank's view, this amounts to recovering metaphysics, a tradition Deleuze ostensibly broke with.
This is seen as a dilution of their initial radical stance and a departure from a consistent philosophical trajectory. A common thread running through many of these rival position critiques from Zizek, Badiou, Hallward, and Frank, for example, is the accusation that Deleuze, despite his radical pronouncements and attempts to break decisively from philosophical tradition like Hegel, Plato, or notions of transcendence, ultimately falls back into or is secretly complicit with the very structures and problematics he aims to critique.
Right. His philosophical revolution is thus perceived by these detractors as incomplete, incoherent, or ultimately a failure to escape the traditions he set out against. This perceived failure often fuels the attacking tone of their criticisms, born perhaps from a frustration with what they see as Deleuze's unfulfilled promise of a truly radical break.
Furthermore, the critiques from thinkers like Laruelle and Bressier can be seen as representing a subsequent wave of attack. They push the critique beyond Deleuze's alleged failure to escape traditional metaphysics. They accuse him, instead of not being radical enough in his conception of immanence, Laruelle, or in his embrace of materialism and nihilism, Brassier. In this evolving critical landscape, Deleuze himself, for these thinkers, becomes a new form of tradition to be philosophically overcome, suggesting that his own radicalism has set a new, higher bar for subsequent philosophical departures.
Okay, we just covered a whole battalion of critics from different philosophical camps. That was a lot. What's the key takeaway from these rival critiques?
Yeah, the core idea seems to be that thinkers from other traditions, Marxists, psychoanalysts, Hegelians like Zizek, metaphysicians like Badiou and Hallward, even those who want to be more radical like Laruelle and Brassier, they look at Deleuze's work and find fundamental problems from their specific perspective. A common thread seems to be the accusation that he didn't truly break from traditional philosophy as much as he claimed, or that his ideas have problematic political implications, either being too abstract or maybe even aligning with systems like capitalism.
Let's flashcard some of these rival critiques. Flashcard 1. Marxist critiques see D&G as potentially recuperating radical thought for the system or diverting energy away from collective action. Think fascism of the potato.
Okay.
Flashcard 2. Psychoanalysts argue anti-Oedipus misrepresents the self in schizophrenia, using it as a kind of rhetorical weapon.
Right.
Flashcard 3. Zizek claims Deleuze is secretly complicit with Hegel and, controversially, an ideologist of late capitalism. Flashcard 4. Badiou sees Deleuze fundamentally as a philosopher of the one, not multiplicity, with weak or underdeveloped politics.
Got it.
Flashcard 5. Hallward views Deleuze as a spiritual idealist trying to escape the actual world, which makes his work politically irrelevant in Hallward's view.
Okay.
Flashcard 6. Laruelle and Brassier critique Deleuze from positions of non-philosophy and speculative realism, basically arguing he's not radical enough and fails to fully break from traditional philosophical constraints.
So many different angles of attack. Now, let's turn to a particularly sharp and public form of criticism that emerged from the so-called science wars of the 1990s. This was a period of intense public debate and controversy about postmodern intellectuals allegedly misusing or misunderstanding scientific concepts and terminology, and Deleuze, often alongside Guattari, was a frequent target in these debates, especially concerning their use of mathematics and physics.
Exactly. These critiques primarily focused on the alleged misuse and misunderstanding of scientific and mathematical terminology by postmodern thinkers. The core accusation was that they were throwing around terms from complex fields like physics, mathematics, biology, without truly understanding their established meaning within those disciplines or using them rigorously in their philosophical work.
The most famous figures associated with this critique were the physicists Alan Sokal and Jean Bricmont, and their highly controversial book, Fashionable Nonsense. Postmodern Intellectuals' Abuse of Science. They launched a broad attack on a range of prominent postmodern thinkers, including Deleuze and Guattari.
Their central accusation was straightforward: the abuse of science. They broke down this abuse into several categories to analyze different ways they felt science was misused. First, superficial erudition, using scientific or pseudoscientific terminology without genuine understanding, often out of context, primarily to impress or intimidate non-specialist readers, just creating an aura of depth.
Second, manipulation of meaningless phrases, employing scientific terms in ways that render them nonsensical or devoid of their established technical meaning within their scientific field, just using the words without the meaning.
Third, gratuitous metaphorization, adopting complex scientific concepts as metaphors without sufficient rigor or justification, or even fabricating entirely pseudo-scientific theories that lack any basis in actual science, using scientific-sounding language to describe philosophical ideas without a proper link.
And fourth, misrepresentation, deliberately misrepresenting established scientific theories and concepts from fields such as topology, that branch of math dealing with shapes and spaces, chaos theory, quantum mechanics.
Right. And while Sokal and Bricmont provided more detailed examples for other figures, Deleuze and Guattari were explicitly included in their list of intellectuals perpetrating what they called physico-mathematical mystifications, using physics and math terms in a way that creates confusion or an unjustified aura of mystery or profundity. The author's aim was to expose what they saw as charlatanism, where imposing jargon and an appearance of scientific erudition masked a fundamental lack of substance or understanding. It was essentially an emperor has no clothes argument. They claimed these thinkers sounded impressive using scientific terms, but had no real scientific understanding behind the terms they used. It's like someone throwing around complex medical terms in conversation to sound knowledgeable about health, but they don't actually understand what they mean or how doctors properly use them.
Now, defenders of Deleuze sometimes argue that his use of scientific concepts is illustrative or analogical, meaning he's using them as comparisons or examples to help explain a philosophical idea, not making direct scientific claims or asserting scientific truths about the world.
However, Sokal and Brickmont generally reject such defenses. They insist on the precise and context-specific meaning of scientific terms. They argue that scientific terms are not just loose metaphors you can use however you like in philosophy. The perceived lack of clarity in Deleuze's writing style, combined with his frequent and often complex use of scientific terminology, fueled their accusations of deliberate mystification and intellectual irresponsibility. That he was being irresponsible by using these terms without respecting their established meaning.
Providing a more focused and technical critique in this vein is the philosopher John Rolfe. In his article, Axiomatic Set Theory and the Work of Deleuze and Guattari, a critique, Rolfe meticulously examines Deleuze and Guattari's engagement with axiomatic set theory, a foundational area of mathematics primarily as it appears in A Thousand Plateaus.
Rolfe argues that their usage involves certain erroneous presentations of the axiomatic method and significant misinterpretations of core set theoretic concepts. He isn't making a broad, general claim. He gets right into the specifics of the math they invoke.
Rolfe identifies several specific areas of alleged misapprehension based on his analysis. One notable example is their statement regarding LF1 and the continuum. D and G say that LF1 possesses the power of the continuum, seemingly stating this as a fact.
Rolfe flags this as a strange error of presentation. To simplify as much as possible, LF1 is a concept from set theory representing the smallest size of infinite set larger than the set of whole numbers, which is LF0. The continuum refers to the size of the set of real numbers, all the numbers on a continuous line. The question of whether the size of the set of real numbers is equal to LF1 is known as the continuum hypothesis. Rolfe points out that this hypothesis is independent of standard set theory, ZFC, meaning it cannot be proven true or false within the standard system, and therefore it cannot be definitively asserted as true as D and G seem to do. It's a complex, unresolved mathematical question, not an established fact.
Another critique involves their use of the concept of puissance, which means power in French. Rolfe argues that Deleuze and Guattari confuse the specific set theoretic meaning of power, which refers to cardinality, the size of a set, or the power set, the set of all subsets, with a more general notion of capacity or force, like power of destruction, of war.
Rolfe finds it hard to see how the static, quantitative notion of set theoretic power dealing with sizes of sets can be literally or rigorously equated with dynamic, destructive forces in the world. It's like confusing the power of a number, like 2 to the power of 3, which is 8, with political power or the destructive power of a weapon. They use the same word, but for fundamentally different mathematical and real-world concepts.
Rolfe's conclusion, based on these and other examples from his detailed analysis, is that despite Deleuze and Guattari's claims of a literal application of concepts from axiomatic set theory, their actual engagement frequently deviates into metaphor or is based on fundamental misunderstandings of the mathematical framework. This detailed critique, grounded in specific textual examples and mathematical definitions, presents a serious challenge to the rigor of Deleuze and Guattari's interdisciplinary borrowings from mathematics.
These science wars critiques, from the broader polemic of Sokal and Brickmont to the detailed analysis by Rolfe, really underscore a fundamental epistemological conflict, a conflict about how we know things, what counts as valid knowledge, and how different disciplines should interact.
Deleuze's philosophical method, which often involves drawing analogies or abstracting principles from scientific and mathematical domains to create concepts for philosophy, is perceived by these critics not as an innovative philosophical practice, but as a misapplication and misunderstanding of scientific knowledge, sometimes even factually incorrect.
And this perceived misuse and factual error, they argue, undermines the integrity and rigor of both the scientific concepts being borrowed and the philosophical arguments being constructed based on those borrowings. The harshness of these attacks often stems from a perceived lack of intellectual accountability in Deleuze's style. His characteristic obscurity and non-traditional argumentation make it difficult for critics to definitively pin down his scientific claims for refutation, leading to charges of intentional mystification and, well, charlatanism.
Okay, we've just covered the science wars criticisms, which include some of the most direct challenges to the factual or rigorous basis of some of Deleuze and Guattari's claims. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, the main point is that critics, especially those from scientific or mathematical backgrounds like Sokal and Brickmont and Roth, accuse D&G of misusing or misunderstanding scientific and mathematical concepts, using them incorrectly, out of context, or just for rhetorical effect. This leads to charges of lacking rigor or even being intellectually dishonest, claiming their work is built on flawed scientific foundations.
Let's do some flashcards summarizing these points on the science wars. Flashcard 1, the science wars context. Critics accuse thinkers like D&G of abusing or misusing science and math.
Right.
Flashcard 2, Sokal and Brickmont's critique, fashionable nonsense. D&G use scientific jargon superficially or nonsensically like charlatans. Flashcard 3, John Ross' technical critique. D&G makes specific errors and misinterpretations when using axiomatic set theory concepts like Aleph 1 or power.
Yeah, the specific.
Flashcard 4, the significance. These critiques aim to show D&G's work is built on flawed understandings, undermining its credibility and rigor.
Clear and to the point. Now, moving beyond general style, method, interpretations of other thinkers or scientific fields, critics also attack the very core concepts Deleuze and often Guattari created. These are the unique building blocks of his philosophy, and they've been subjected to intense criticism regarding their coherence, their meaning, and their implications.
These critiques often attack the coherence of the concepts themselves, their implications, or their alleged detachment from concrete reality. One central concept is Deleuze's distinction between the virtual and the actual, which is fundamental to his metaphysics, his theory of the nature of reality.
Right. And this concept has drawn significant fire, particularly from critics who see it as a slide into idealism, philosophies that prioritize mind or ideas over material reality, or a disengagement from concrete material concerns. Peter Hallward is a leading voice here, arguing that Deleuze is entirely a philosopher of the virtual, one who seeks merely to escape and to destroy the actual.
For Hallward, this overwhelming focus on the virtual, the realm of potential, positions Deleuze as a spiritual and extra-worldly philosopher. His thought offers no genuine insight into material conditions and is ultimately indifferent to real-world political struggle. Hallward contends that Deleuze elevates the creative process of virtuality, the potential for creation, at the expense of any actual products, the things that are created and exist in the world. He argues this renders Deleuze incapable of truly valuing or engaging with anything in the existing actual world.
Slavoj Žižek echoes this concern about the instability of the virtual actual concepts, claiming they merely rehash the old philosophical opposition between idealism and materialism, failing to offer a truly new path for understanding reality. More pointedly, as we discussed earlier, Žižek identifies an alleged inconsistency in the causal power attributed to the virtual, shifting from a passive effect in Deleuze's earlier solo works to an active, productive cause in his later collaborations with Guattari in works like Anti-Oedipus.
Bressier, with his eliminative materialism, which seeks to explain away mental states as purely material processes, would likely also view the virtual, if not strictly reducible to material actualities, as a problematic idealist construct, inconsistent with a rigorous scientific ontology that focuses on material existence.
Defenders, such as Stephen Shaviro, counter these critiques. Shaviro argues that the virtual is real without being actual, and represents the very conditions of actual experience, the potential from which actual things emerge, not an escape from it. He argues the virtual is what makes actualization possible, and explains novelty.
Deleuze himself aimed to replace the problematic philosophical opposition between the possible, seen as a less real version of the real, and the real with the virtual actual couple precisely to account for the production of genuine novelty and difference in the world. Nevertheless, the abstract nature of the virtual and its complex relationship to actuality remain a persistent source of critical attack, fueling accusations of idealism and detachment from concrete reality.
Desire is another highly contested core concept, particularly as developed with Guattari in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. Their theory of desiring machines, seeing systems from the body to social structures as machines producing flows of desire, and the assertion that desire produces reality radically breaks from traditional psychoanalytic notions of desire as lack, the idea that desire stems from a fundamental absence, need, or castration.
Marxist critics, such as Alain Badiou in his early phase, express alarm at this valorization of rhizomatic desire. They fear it would dissipate revolutionary energy into an anarchy of desires or a fascism of the potato, a scattered, unfocused energy, ultimately serving bourgeois individualism and the existing system rather than fostering collective struggle needed for revolution.
Similarly, Anthony Elliot critiques the underlying assumption in Deleuze and Guattari that desire is naturally rebellious and subversive, viewing this as politically naive. Desire can just as easily be conformist, directed towards consumption, or channeled by power structures, rather than being an inherently revolutionary force.
Some commentators, like Augusto Del Noce, have argued that the Deleuze-Guattarian fusion of desire, with social production seeing desire as a driving force in how society produces things and experiences, leads not to liberation or revolution, but to the consumer-oriented sexual revolution, seeing it as a logical endpoint of Marxist materialism or capitalist control of desire rather than a radical departure.
From the psychoanalytic perspective, Deleuze and Guattari's rejection of desire as lack is a fundamental point of contention. Critics argue that their notion of desire as pure plenitude, seeing desire as always full, positive, and productive, misrepresents the complexities of human psychic reality and the crucial role of the symbolic order, language, social rules, the law, and structuring experience, which psychoanalysis sees as involving fundamental lack and division within the subject.
Gayatri Spivak, in her influential essay Can the Subaltern Speak?, criticizes Deleuze and Guattari for a failure to adequately theorize the relations between desire, power, and subjectivity, how desire interacts with power structures and shapes who we are as subjects. This omission, she argues, renders them unable to properly theorize interests and leads to a problematic indifference to ideology, the systems of ideas and beliefs that shape our understanding of the world and our place in it.
Spivak suggests that when the connection between desire and the subject is merely reversed or dismissed, as she argues D&G do, the subject effect that surreptitiously emerges is much like the generalized ideological subject of the theorist, meaning they end up projecting their own subjective position and assumptions onto everyone, implying a hidden universalism or Western bias in their account, despite claiming to think difference and escape fixed subjects.
The concept of becoming woman, along with other becomings like becoming animal, becoming molecular, becoming imperceptible, has been a focal point for feminist critiques. These concepts are intended by D&G as a process of deterritorialization and escape from fixed molar identities, large-scale, stable social identities like man or woman as social categories.
While intended as a way to think beyond rigid gender identities, many feminist thinkers have found becoming woman to be deeply problematic. The charges are varied and severe. Critics argue that the concept often relies on or reinforces a stereotypical rendering of femininity, using cliches or essentialized notions about women rather than engaging with the complexity and diversity of gender as lived.
A significant concern is that becoming woman is primarily theorized as a process for men, appropriating femininity for the purposes of men's becoming, while actual women and their specific experiences and struggles are marginalized or used as a tool or philosophical vehicle. It's seen as men using abstract femininity for their own philosophical project of escaping fixed identities.
The concept is also accused of neglecting women's specificity and the concrete struggles of actually existing women for liberation and equality. Elizabeth Graz, a feminist philosopher influenced by Deleuze, points to Deleuze and Guattari's, quote, apparent inattentiveness to the specificity of women and lack of awareness of their own masculine subject position. She highlights the risk that women are still positioned as vehicles for these processes of becoming, rather than as subjects themselves with their own agency and goals.
Some critics argue that the concept, despite its seemingly radical intent to dissolve fixed identity, may conceal masculine and ethnocentric, androgynous, or even patriarchal assumptions, ultimately reinforcing traditional power dynamics or gender stereotypes rather than dissolving them.
As noted in the introduction to Infinite Eros, cited in the source, the Deleuze-Guattarian affirmation of dissolution, the idea of breaking down fixed identities, is problematic for those who have yet to solidify their identities. This can be particularly relevant for women, minority groups, or other marginalized populations who may need to establish stable subject positions and collective identities in order to organize, fight for their rights and recognition, and gain political power, rather than dissolving them.
Rosie Brodati, while engaging sympathetically with Deleuze, suggests that becoming woman as a process can only be adequately mapped along sexually differentiated lines, acknowledging the reality of biological sex and gender as lived, embodied experiences. She claims Deleuze and Guattari failed to consider this necessary dimension, making their concept less useful for understanding actual gender dynamics and the complexities of identity.
These feminist critiques suggest that becoming woman, one of the few instances where Deleuze and Guattari directly address sex and femininity in detail, may ultimately efface women or reinscribe problematic gender dynamics, rendering it of limited use or even counterproductive for feminist theory and politics.
Deleuze's self-description of his philosophy as transcendental empiricism has also been a target of criticism regarding its coherence and foundational presuppositions. As we briefly touched on earlier, one line of critique argues that Deleuze conflates the methodological sense of transcendental, concerned with identifying the conditions of possible experience, as in Kant's philosophy, what must be true for us to have any experience at all, with an ontological sense, referring to the conditions of real experience, which for Deleuze is the virtual, what makes reality possible.
This critique further claims that Deleuze does not explicitly deploy traditional transcendental arguments that try to identify necessary conditions for something to be possible, to ground his metaphysical system. He uses the term transcendental in a different way than the Kantian tradition. Maybe a simpler way to think about transcendental empiricism is wanting to find the fundamental building blocks or conditions of reality itself through a rigorous examination of experience, not just the building blocks of our knowledge or possible experience of reality like Kant aimed for.
Another point of attack, articulated by a Reddit user in The Source, suggests that Deleuze's transcendental empiricism and its claim to access pure difference, empirically experiencing difference directly as the basic reality without relying on objective or subjective presuppositions, nevertheless seems to presuppose A, the logical concepts used to analyze this pure difference, and 2, the givenness of empirical experience, which is always subject to skeptical doubt.
This is contrasted with Hegel's allegedly more rigorously presuppositionless ontology, which Hegel believes started without any assumptions at all. While the translator's note to a book on the subject frames Deleuze's empiricism as a radical reassessment that disintegrates continental philosophy, these critiques question its internal consistency and whether it truly avoids the foundational assumptions it claims to bypass.
Deleuze's doctrine of the univocity of being, borrowed and adapted from the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus, asserts that being existence itself, what it means to be, is said in a single voice, or in a single sense, across all the infinite differences of things that exist. This leads to his provocative formulation, pluralism, monism, the idea that extreme diversity and multiplicity paradoxically amount to a form of oneness at the most fundamental level of being itself. Think of it like all different kinds of music being fundamentally made of the same basic elements, like sound waves, rhythm, and melody, just arranged differently. Univocity of being is kind of like that. For existence itself, everything exists in vastly different ways. But being itself is one fundamental underlying reality or concept, even in its infinite variety.
Right. This concept has been challenged, notably by Alain Badiou, who argues that Deleuze's metaphysics, despite its surface appearance of embracing plurality and diversity, remains fundamentally monist, leading to an ascetic, aristocratic fatalism akin to ancient Stoicism, which emphasized acceptance of fate and a cosmic order. As we saw earlier, Badiou believes despite all the talk of multiplicity, Deleuze is ultimately a philosopher of oneness, and this leads to a rigid, deterministic view.
Cadme also identifies a potential contradiction, suggesting that Deleuze's insistence on difference being ontologically primary, the most fundamental aspect of reality is difference itself, is at odds with his embrace of immanence and monism. How can difference be primary and truly different if ultimately everything is part of a single, undifferentiated, immanent being?
Nathan Witter's analysis of Deleuze's engagement with Scotus and Spinoza regarding univocity suggests a more complex picture. Witter argues that Deleuze himself found Spinoza's formulation of univocity to be incomplete, believing Spinoza still gave priority to substance or identity over modes or difference. According to Witter, Deleuze felt that a true univocity of difference, where difference itself is what is said in a single voice, where being is difference, was only fully realized in Nietzsche's philosophy. This implies an internal evolution or recognized limitation within Deleuze's own development of the concept over time, rather than a straightforward contradiction in its final mature form, suggesting his understanding changed.
The concepts of the body without organs, BWO and rhizomatics, central to Deleuze and Guattari's collaborative works, are frequently criticized for their ambiguity and potentially problematic implications. The BWO was acknowledged even by commentators as one of their more ambiguous concepts and terms. Its meaning shifts significantly across their oeuvre and is sometimes used interchangeably with the plane of immanence, the single consistent plane of reality.
This inherent fuzziness, or lack of fixed definition, lends itself readily to charges of incoherence and makes it difficult to grasp precisely what they mean. Some critics, echoing the sentiment of a Reddit user who exclaimed, "We need organs," find the call to create a BWO, which involves dismantling the organismic structure of the body and the conventional organization of the self and its desires, to be nonsensical or even dangerous. How can you even think, perceive, or act without some kind of structure, some kind of organization, even if it's not the traditional one? Imagine the BWO as a blank slate, or maybe something formless and undefined, a smooth space. The critique is, how can you even think or act without some kind of structure? What does it even mean to be without organs?
While rhizomatics is presented as a model of non-hierarchical, centered, and multiplicitous connections, like a network without a center point or a clear beginning or end, its practical application and the implications of its principle of a signifying rupture or breaking connections that produce fixed meanings or identities can be interpreted as promoting chaos or a politically naive form of disorganization that is ineffective for building movements.
The Dark Deleuze project, for instance, seeks to unearth a revolutionary negativity within such concepts, pushing back against interpretations that emphasize only their joyous or purely affirmative aspects. This highlights the contested and potentially unsettling nature of these ideas, which some see as pointing towards difficult, perhaps even destructive transformations or challenging existing norms in a way that is not simply positive or liberating. Think of the rhizome as spreading, tangled roots, potentially disruptive to what's on the surface.
Many critiques of Deleuze's core concepts, the virtual, desire, becoming woman, the BWO, they seem to converge on a perceived disconnect between his highly abstract, often described as inhuman, conceptualizations and the concrete lived realities of individuals, specific social groups, or political struggles.
Exactly. Critics often argue that these concepts either erase necessary specificities, for example, effacing the unique lived experience of women in the case of becoming woman, or lead to politically naive or even counterproductive implications, like suggesting desire is inherently rebellious when it can be easily controlled by consumerism, or that focusing on the virtual leads to detachment from material conditions and the necessity of engaging with them.
This reveals a fundamental tension. Deleuze's philosophical effort to forge concepts that escape existing molar identities and representational frameworks is frequently seen by his detractors as a failure to adequately account for or meaningfully engage with the actualities of those identities and the political struggles that surround them. The attacking tone often arises from a sense that Deleuze's abstractions are either irresponsible or dismissive of concrete forms of suffering, oppression, and organized struggle in the real world.
Furthermore, the pronounced ambiguity inherent in some of Deleuze's most iconic concepts, such as the BWO or the evolving meaning of intensity, presents a double-edged sword.
While this fluidity allows for conceptual creativity and adaptability qualities, Deleuze himself prized as philosophy responding to problems. It simultaneously exposes his work to accusations of incoherence, a lack of intellectual rigor, and an inability to ground practical or political programs effectively. This conceptual slipperiness can lead to considerable frustration among critics and accusations that the concepts are ultimately too vague to be meaningful or can be twisted to mean anything, thereby lacking genuine philosophical power for robust explanation or critique. This echoes Pascal Engel's broader criticism of Deleuze's metaphilosophy, which claims it makes disagreement impossible because terms aren't stable.
Okay, we've just finished covering a lot of Deleuze's major concepts and the specific problems critics find with them. From the virtual to desire, becoming a woman, and the body without organs, what's the big picture criticism here?
Yeah, the main charge seems to be that these highly abstract concepts, while maybe creative, feel detached from real-world experience and political struggles. Critics worry they either ignore the specific realities of people's lives or lead to politically problematic conclusions. Plus, their inherent ambiguity makes them really hard to engage with rigorously.
Okay, final mega recap and flashcards for this section, focusing on critiques of specific concepts. Flashcard 1, the virtual. Critics like Hallward see it as leading to idealism and an escape from the actual world, making it politically irrelevant.
Right.
Flashcard 2, desire. Critics, Marxists, psychoanalysts argue D&G's view of desire as productive rebellious is politically naive, aligns with capitalism, or ignores psychological complexity like desire as lack.
Okay.
Flashcard 3, becoming woman. Feminist critics argue it relies on stereotypes, appropriates femininity for men, neglects women's specificity and struggles, and is problematic for identity formation for marginalized groups. Flashcard 4, transcendental empiricism. Criticized for potentially conflating types of transcendental and maybe presupposing concepts it claims to avoid. Flashcard 5, univocity of being. Badiou and May see it as leading back to monism or oneness, potentially contradicting Deleuze's emphasis on difference. Flashcard 6, BWO and rhizomatics. Criticized for ambiguity, potential incoherence, or promoting chaos or political naivety in practice.
Phew.
Yeah.
That really is a challenging set of ideas and criticisms.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's look at criticisms that go beyond just style or interpretation and claim that Deleuze simply misunderstood or made factual errors regarding the material he engaged with. This is about critics claiming he got things objectively wrong, misstated facts, or misunderstood concepts in their original context.
Yes, this is a prominent area where Deleuze, often with Guattari, is accused of specific mistakes, particularly when drawing from fields outside of traditional philosophy. The critiques stemming from the science wars, notably by Alan Sokal and Jean Bricmont in Fashionable Nonsense, and John Roff's detailed analysis of Deleuze and Guattari's use of axiomatic set theory, exemplify this line of attack. These are not merely critiques of loose analogy or interpretation, but direct claims of substantive errors in understanding and applying concepts from disciplines like mathematics and science.
Right. Roff, for instance, provides this meticulous deconstruction of passages in A Thousand Plateaus, arguing that Deleuze and Guattari make factually incorrect statements regarding mathematical concepts.
He points to specific instances of fundamental misunderstandings of the source material. We talked about their claims regarding Aleph-1 and the continuum hypothesis, stating a hypothesis is a fact, the nature of infinite sets, confusing denumerable and non-denumerable infinities incorrectly, the meaning of power or cardinality in set theory, confusing mathematical size with force, their use of Scullom's paradox, misinterpreting its implications, their interpretation of the included middle from intuitionist logic, attributing a law they didn't propose, their definition of a minority as a non-denumerable set, mathematically incorrect, and their extrapolation of the undecidable from Gödel's theorems to problems in capitalism, extending a result from formal systems to social science without justification. These are presented as concrete examples where, according to Roff, D&G simply got the math wrong.
And Sokal and Bricmont, while perhaps less technically detailed than Roff, cast a wider net but make similar claims of factual or conceptual error. They accuse Deleuze and Guattari of a pattern of misusing scientific and mathematical terms to create an aura of profundity, without genuine comprehension of those terms within their scientific contexts. They see this not as innovative philosophy, but as intellectual carelessness or even dishonesty.
Yeah, the accusations of factual errors or misconceptions in these scientific and mathematical domains often serve as a powerful rhetorical strategy for critics. By attempting to demonstrate that Deleuze is demonstrably wrong about established scientific or mathematical principles, areas often seen as more objective, verifiable, or rigorous than abstract philosophy, these critics seek to cast broader doubt on the reliability and intellectual rigor of his more abstract philosophical claims.
It's like, if Deleuze is perceived as careless, mistaken, or factually wrong in these harder, more formally defined disciplines, the inference is that his more elusive philosophical concepts might also be built on shaky foundations or suffer from a similar lack of precision and rigor. The often attacking tone in critiques like Fashionable Nonsense derives in part from this perceived intellectual irresponsibility and a desire to expose what they see as a misuse of scientific authority for philosophical gain. Basically saying he's faking scientific knowledge to sound smart.
Exactly. Now, moving on to alleged misconceptions in his interpretations of other philosophers. As detailed earlier, Deleuze's creative approach to the history of philosophy has also led to numerous accusations of misinterpretation that critics frame as outright misunderstandings.
The claim by Carrie Burchat and various Reddit commentators that Deleuze fundamentally misrepresents Nietzsche's eternal return of the same by transforming it into an eternal return of the different is presented as a direct allegation of a misconception of a core Nietzschean doctrine. They argue he didn't just reinterpret it creatively, he misunderstood what Nietzsche meant by the same and its significance.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, the critique that Deleuze anachronistically systematizes Nietzsche, imposing a systematic structure on a philosopher who famously eschewed system building, can be framed as a misunderstanding of Nietzsche's philosophical ethos or core anti-systematic drive. Critics argue he missed or ignored Nietzsche's explicit method.
And the argument presented in the Xenogothic blog post that Deleuze imposes an anti-Bergsonian structure of stages and progress onto Henri Bergson's philosophy of duration is another clear accusation of misunderstanding or misrepresenting a philosopher's central ideas of a continuous, indivisible flow.
The boundary between Deleuze's avowed method of creative interpretation or philosophical buggery, which he characterizes as revealing a monstrous offspring that is nevertheless true to the hidden emissions or potentials of an author, and what critics deem outright misunderstanding or violent distortion, well, that boundary is often thin and highly contested.
While Deleuze's defenders might argue that he is creating new concepts from these thinkers, not merely restating them, The charge of misunderstanding or misconception gains significant traction when the transformation appears to directly contradict explicit statements or foundational tenets of the original philosopher, as argued by Burchett regarding Nietzsche's eternal return. In such cases, the critique moves beyond a mere difference in interpretive philosophy to an allegation of flawed or unfair scholarship, that he simply got it wrong in a way that violates scholarly standards or the original author's clear intent.
Right. And beyond specific scientific or historical interpretations, some critics imply that Deleuze misunderstands entire broader conceptual fields he engages with. For example, some psychoanalytic critics suggest Deleuze and Guattari misconstrue the psychoanalytic concept of lack, presenting it simplistically in order to advance their own theory of desire as pure plenitude. They are accused of not grasping the complexity and necessity of lack within psychoanalytic theory as developed by Freud and Lacan.
And Gayatri Spivak's argument that Deleuze and Guattari failed to adequately consider the complex interplay of desire, power, and subjectivity, leading to an indifference towards ideology. Well, that could also be interpreted as a charge of misunderstanding or neglecting crucial sociopolitical and psychosocial dynamics in their conceptual framework. Critics might argue they failed to grasp how these forces are intertwined in shaping individuals and society.
These varied accusations of misunderstandings, misconceptions, and factual errors contribute significantly to the perception of Deleuze's work as invalid or unreliable among his detractors. They form a powerful line of criticism that claims his work is built on factual or interpretive errors, undermining its intellectual foundation.
Okay, we've just looked at critiques claiming Deleuze simply got things wrong, facts, concepts, or other philosophers' ideas. What should we remember here?
Let's do flashcards for misunderstandings. Flashcard 1. Critics from the science wars, so-called Brickmont, Rothmore, allege specific factual errors and misunderstandings in D&G's use of science and math concepts.
Right, the factual stuff.
Flashcard 2. Critics also claim Deleuze misunderstands or misrepresents other philosophers, such as Nietzsche's eternal return or Bergson's concept of duration.
Okay, the interpretations.
Flashcard 3. Broader claims include misunderstanding psychoanalytic concepts like lack or sociopolitical dynamics like the interplay of desire, power, and ideology.
Wider fields, yeah.
Flashcard 4. These accusations are powerful because they suggest Deleuze's work is built on flawed foundations, that he fundamentally didn't grasp the material he was working with accurately.
So it's not just disagreeing with his conclusions, but claiming he fundamentally didn't grasp the material he was working with in the first place. Now, let's try and bring together all the different criticisms we've discussed: style, incoherence, interpretations, rival schools, science misuse, problematic concepts, and these alleged errors to see the overall picture painted by Deleuze's harshest detractors. This section synthesizes the major lines of harsh critique to construct an account of the invalid Deleuze as seen through the eyes of his most severe critics.
Right. The attacks on Deleuze are diverse, coming from many angles, but they often converge on several key points that his most severe detractors emphasize. Our source recapitalizes some of the major harsh critiques we've mentioned. William F. Bellicella excoriates Deleuze for what he sees as stylistic obscurity, masking conceptual vacuity and silly-ass posturing, lacking genuine argumentative substance.
Sokal and Brickmont accused Deleuze and Guattari of intellectual charlatanism, alleging a systematic abuse and misunderstanding of scientific and mathematical concepts to lend an unearned air of profundity to their philosophical speculations.
Peter Hallward dismisses Deleuze's philosophy as an otherworldly idealism, a spiritual quest for pure creation, focused on the virtual that renders his thought politically impotent and irrelevant to concrete material struggles and political engagement.
Slavoj Žižek, from his Hegelio-Lacanian standpoint, critiques Deleuze's anti-Hegelianism as flawed and ultimately complicit with dialectical structures, and controversially labels the Deleuze of anti-Oedipus an ideologist of late capitalism, claiming his philosophy of desire aligns with capitalist logic.
Alain Badiou argues that Deleuze's supposed philosophy of multiplicity and becoming is, at its core, a metaphysics of the one, and that his vitalism is misguided and his politics weak. These prominent critiques, often delivered with a sharply polemical edge, a strong, argumentative, sometimes aggressive tone, form the backbone of the case against Deleuze's philosophical validity and positive contribution, at least as presented by his detractors.
Looking across all these criticisms, several common threads seem to run through the myriad accusations of contradiction, inconsistency, and incoherence. One persistent charge is that Deleuze's dense, jargon-filled prose and neologisms serve not to express profound or complex ideas, but to deliberately obscure a lack of substantive content or clear argumentation.
Yeah, the difficulty of his texts is thus seen by these critics as a deliberate barrier, a way to hide the lack of philosophical rigor or substance, rather than a necessary consequence of the ideas themselves being genuinely difficult to express.
Critics also point to the systematic ambiguity and conceptual fluidity in his work. The shifting meanings of key Deleuzian concepts like intensity across different works, or the fuzzy and evolving nature of the body without organs, are seen as a fundamental flaw that prevents clear philosophical engagement.
This conceptual plasticity, while defended by some as continuous variation necessary for concepts in becoming, is seen by detractors as making his ideas too slippery to pin down, evaluate, or refute, potentially bordering on the unfalsifiable. If you can't pin it down, you can't critique it meaningfully according to traditional philosophical standards.
Another common thread is the idea of failed philosophical revolutions. Deleuze's ambitious attempts to overturn or radically reinterpret major philosophical traditions like Platonism, Kantianism, Hegelianism are often judged by critics as ultimately unsuccessful.
They argue that he either falls back into the very problematics he seeks to escape, as argued by Schick regarding Hegel, or Frank regarding metaphysics, or, in breaking from tradition, he abandons philosophical rigor and intelligibility altogether, as argued by Engel. They see him as either not truly escaping the old problems or doing so at too high a cost to what counts as philosophy.
The charges of misapplication and misunderstanding of external frameworks, science, math, other philosophers, are also central to the argument that Deleuze's work is built on faulty foundations.
This includes the alleged misusing scientific and mathematical concepts and misinterpreting canonical philosophers. These critiques suggest a lack of scholarly diligence or a fundamental misunderstanding of the fields from which he borrows heavily, undermining the credibility of his own philosophical claims.
And finally, a powerful line of attack contends that Deleuze's abstract conceptual systems, such as the virtual, desiring production, or lines of flight, are disconnected from, or unable to adequately account for, material, social, and political actualities.
Right. This perceived detachment leads to charges of idealism, political naivety, or even irresponsibility. His abstract world of concepts seems to ignore or fail to help us understand the concrete world we live in, with its real problems, inequalities, and struggles, and may even align with problematic forces like capitalism.
The often attacking tone of these critiques might not be merely incidental. For some critics, particularly those who might have initially been drawn to Deleuze's promise of radical critique and philosophical novelty, there could be a profound sense of frustration or even betrayal when they find his work wanting.
Exactly. When Deleuze's work is perceived as failing to deliver on this promise, for instance, by being co-opted by the very systems it critiques, as Ejek suggests with the label ideologist of late capitalism, or Lefebvre with recuperation of radical thought by institutions, or by leading to political quietism or detachment instead of action, as Hallward argues, the criticism can become particularly severe and emotionally charged.
This harshness might stem from a disappointment that Deleuze's philosophy, despite its radical veneer and exciting language, ultimately misdirects or maybe even defangs genuine critical thought, becoming what some critics might see as a false friend to emancipatory projects, movements aiming for liberation or social change, because its abstractness or alleged flaws prevent it from being an effective tool for real-world transformation.
So, synthesizing these various lines of attack, the portrait of Gilles Deleuze that emerges from his most severe detractors is that of a philosopher whose influence is perhaps seen as more pernicious or misleading than genuinely productive from their perspective. He is depicted as
The obscurantist stylist who prioritized literary flourish and neologistic invention over clarity and coherent argumentation, making his work inaccessible and resistant to rational evaluation.
a thinker whose core concepts are riddled with internal contradictions, systematic ambiguities, or are based on fundamental misinterpretations and factual errors drawn from the philosophical and scientific traditions he engages with.
An idealist or spiritualist whose focus on abstract notions like pure creation and the virtual leads to a detachment from material reality and renders his philosophy politically naive, impotent, or irrelevant to concrete human struggles.
A philosopher who, despite his claims of radical immanence and rupture from the past, often remains trapped within traditional philosophical frameworks or inadvertently replicates their problematic aspects, failing to achieve a genuine break from the history of metaphysics.
An intellectual dilettante who allegedly misuses concepts from other disciplines, particularly science and mathematics, to lend an unearned veneer of profundity or rigor to his philosophical speculations, rather than engaging with them properly.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to note, as our source material points out, that this portrait is the one constructed by his critics. It reflects their perspective and their criteria. This is how his harshest detractors see him, based on the points we've covered in this deep dive.
Deleuze's defenders, and Deleuze himself, often reframe these perceived flaws as necessary features of a philosophical project dedicated to thinking difference, becoming, and the limits of representation in ways that challenge traditional norms.
Exactly. For example, what critics label as obscurity, defenders might see as an attempt to articulate concepts that resist easy formulation in conventional language, or maybe to shake us from the normative by forcing us to think differently and develop new ways of understanding.
What is decried as inconsistency, Deleuzians might term the continuous variation inherent in the becoming of concepts, which is seen as a natural response to engaging with different problematics or problems over time and across different works.
Deleuze's misinterpretations of past philosophers are, from his own perspective or that of his defenders, acts of creative buggery or portraiture, designed to produce new conceptual possibilities and bring past thinkers into dialogue with contemporary problems, not literal exegesis or neutral scholarship.
This fundamental divergence in metaphilosophical commitments and evaluative criteria, this basic disagreement about what philosophy is, what its goals are, and how it should be judged, creates a deep impasse. The very grounds for critique are debated, making a definitive, universally accepted refutation of Deleuze exceptionally challenging from within a shared philosophical framework. Because the critics and defenders don't even agree on what the rules of the philosophical game are supposed to be.
Right. And the attacking tone of many critiques can, from this angle, be understood as a consequence of this profound incommensurability of philosophical projects. It's not just disagreeing on specific points, but disagreeing on what philosophy is and how it should be done, which makes the debate particularly fierce and sometimes difficult to resolve.
Okay, we've just pulled all the threads together to see the critic's overall picture of Deleuze, as presented in our source. It's a powerful and often negative portrait. Let's capture the main points one last time.
Okay, final flashcards for the synthesis. Flashcard 1. Critics commonly see Deleuze's obscurity as hiding a lack of substance and his concepts as systematically ambiguous.
Right, obscurity and ambiguity.
Flashcard 2. They argue his attempts at philosophical revolution fail, either falling back into tradition or abandoning rigor and clarity.
Failed revolution.
Flashcard 3. A key charge is that he misuses concepts from science math and misinterprets other philosophers, building on faulty foundations.
Misuse and misinterpretation.
Flashcard 4. Critics feel his abstract concepts are detached from concrete reality, leading to charges of idealism or political naive and irrelevance.
Detachment.
Flashcard 5. The overall portrait by detractors.
Obscurantist,
Contradictory, idealist, failed revolutionary, intellectual, dilettante.
That's the summary picture.
Flashcard 6. But, important note, this is the critic's view. Defenders see these points very differently, rooted in a fundamental disagreement about the goals and methods of philosophy itself, making the debate incredibly complex.
That gives us a really clear picture of the battleground surrounding Deleuze's work, at least seen from the critic's perspective. So we've just completed a pretty deep dive into the critical landscape surrounding Gilles Deleuze, guided entirely by our source material. We focus specifically on the criticisms leveled against him, the alleged invalidities, the points of attack on his style, his method, the coherence of his ideas, his interpretations of other thinkers, the attacks from rival schools, his alleged misuse of science, and the problems critics find with his core concepts like the virtual, desire, and the body without organs.
Yeah, and the persistent, often really vehement nature of these attacks underscores Deleuze's status as a deeply unsettling and transformative figure in contemporary thought. The very features that proponents praise, his break with representational thought, his affirmation of difference and becoming, his creation of new conceptual assemblages, are often the precise targets of his most severe critics.
It's clear this is a fierce debate, and the critiques we've discussed today are just one side of the story. An important side, a significant and detailed one based on our source, but still just one side.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for you if you're maybe newer to philosophy. Encountering such a complex and controversial figure, we've seen how even major figures face intense criticism, and how that criticism comes from so many different angles and perspectives, sometimes even disagreeing among themselves about why he's wrong.
So here's a provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. Given the intensity and the sheer variety of these criticisms, from accusations of deliberate obscurity to fundamental misunderstandings of scientific concepts and even politically problematic implications, how does knowing about these challenges shape your perspective when you encounter a complex or difficult thinker? Does knowing the critiques make you more cautious, maybe more skeptical? Or does it perhaps intrigue you more, make you want to see what exactly provokes such strong reactions?
And, perhaps more fundamentally, if even the grounds for evaluating philosophical work are debated, as our source suggests is the case with the Deleuze critiques, if critics and defenders don't even agree on what counts as a valid argument or a good interpretation, how do you decide which ideas are valid or worth pursuing when you encounter challenging thinkers? Especially those whose work pushes the boundaries of what philosophy is or how it should be done. It encourages critical engagement not just with the ideas themselves, but maybe with the standards by which we judge philosophical ideas in the first place.
A lot to chew on there, definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the critics of Gilles Deleuze.